All right, let's talk about satire. So our next unit is going to focus on this particular genre of literature. And the reason that we're focusing on it is because for question 2, which is the prose FRQ, multiple times in the past they've given a passage that was satirical. So you really want to make sure that you know how to recognize it, know how to analyze it, and see it for what it is. Because satire can be kind of complex, especially to explain. So let's start there with the explanation. Now, the dictionary definition says it's the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics or other topical issues. So that's a very really wordy definition, but what it comes down to is what's in the what's marked in red here at the bottom. It says, satire mocks a flaw in the hopes of inspiring change. So right here is kind of the heart of what satire is. So if I'm a satirist, which is someone who creates satire, I look at a flaw in society and I'm going to poke fun at it, mock it, in order to hopefully create some sort of change. So for example, if the flaw I recognize is that people are always on their cell phones, I might create a little skit that has people walking around running into each other because their eyes are glued to their screens. It's kind of creating that humorous situation, but ultimately I'm pointing out a problem, and that's really what satire is. So if we look at some examples, which I think is really the best way to understand what satire is, there's a lot of different ways it can manifest. The first one we have here is movies and TV shows. There's lots of different examples of satire. Parody movies, for example, like it has a scary movie up here, or there was Vampire Sucks, but any type of movie that's kind of poking fun at a different genre or something is an example of satire. A lot of times television shows, especially like Family Guys and The Simpsons, will satire or satirize a movie or a play or something like that, and that's another form of satire. The next category right here is sketch comedy, and you're probably most familiar with Saturday Night Live, but there's also Mad TV, Kids in the Hall, and there's kind of a growing number of different shows that kind of embrace that sketch comedy, which we'll talk about as we kind of get going here. But Saturday Night Live, I think, is the best example, and we'll look at some different sketches to talk about how that's being satirical. But when you think about Saturday Night Live, it's something that's funny, but if you've ever seen it, you know it's always centered on different issues or flaws that they're recognizing. Stand-up comedy is often satirical. Just in its nature, it uses a lot of exaggeration and humor to kind of point to real issues. For example, Kevin Hart has a special that's on Netflix. It's called Laugh at My Pain. It's one of his earlier ones. And in it, he talks about some things that are really kind of dark in his past, his father's drug addiction, his absence, things like that. But through the use of caricature and exaggeration, it comes off as funny. And that's an example of satire. It can appear in literature and short stories. For example, A Modest Proposal is an essay written by Jonathan Swift. And in that essay, he is proposing that the starving Irish people should eat their many children as a solution. Obviously, surface level, that's horrifying. You should never eat babies. But he's pointing out that since nothing was being done at the time, he's pointing out a ridiculous solution. Again, pointing out a flaw in order to create that change. Web comics are often satirical, and we'll look at one in a second, so I'll kind of just skip through that one. Joke news or newspapers, if you have ever read something from The Onion, they're not meant to be sincere news articles. They are satirical, again, pointing out some sort of flaw to create that change. Right here it has The Colbert Report and Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. I think another, news type show that does it is The Trevor Noah Show, which is The Daily Show. He's the host. But The Daily Show will have little sketches, which are satirical as well. For example, I just saw one the other day where he sent out people to interview Trump supporters, and while on the surface, it seems like a genuine attempt to get information and a genuine investigative report. It really comes off as quite silly based on the responses that they selected. Memes are very satirical. For example, First World Problems. Obviously, the flaw is that people in America and first world countries are very privileged, and they don't recognize that. So that is the flaw in society that's being pointed out. And then the last one is political cartoons. Now, you don't necessarily encounter a lot of political cartoons in your daily life anymore, especially if your family doesn't subscribe to a newspaper. But there's still online medias that produce them, and they're often a very good source of satire because they're usually about topical, relevant, current events, but their intention is to poke fun and mock. So another good example. So where does that play into like a narrative perspective and point of view? So part of analyzing narrative perspective is to think about the speaker's tone. So when we're saying speaker in this case, it's the character that's narrating. And if it is using a tone that you would call sarcastic, witty, sardonic, wry, those are often ways to describe the speaker's tone if it's a satirical text. So, for example, there's a past prompt that is from a play, and it's characters going back and forth, and their responses, one of the responses of the characters is very sarcastic. So if I was to analyze that character's sarcastic tone, I would be analyzing the satire in the piece. And for this next point, when it says, what does that say about perspective? Really, when we're thinking about perspective in this case, there's kind of two pieces, because there's the character perspective, but there's also the writer's perspective. So, for example, a character is going to have that surface level. So that up front, what words are coming out of their mouth, that is the speaker or the character's perspective. But when we're looking at satire, we also need to connect that then to the writer's perspective. For example, you'll have a prose FRQ coming up where the question is genuinely asking about the writer's views on society. If you see that society question, they're really looking for the writer's perspective, and oftentimes that text is satirical, so pay attention for that. And then we've talked about part of narrative perspective is the reliability of the speaker. And when we're talking about a satirical text, that reliability is kind of gone, right? Because that character or that narrator is being sarcastic or is creating this alternate response, this satirical response that alters their credibility, because we know there's that dual meaning behind all of it. So that's just kind of like how satire plays into our standard, which is narrative perspective. It's really about the tone of the speaker, but like I said, in this case, narrative perspective is also about the writer and what their what message they're trying to create, what change they want. So there's a few subgenres when we're talking about satire. The first one is called a diatribe. Now, diatribe is kind of like a ranty monologue. So oftentimes, like when comedians host award shows, they'll open it up with some sort of opening monologue. And in doing so, if that monologue is very pointed and aggressive, it can be called a diatribe. A good example, I think this last year, Ricky Gervais kind of got some heat for his opening monologue for the Golden Globes. And that would be considered a diatribe because it was kind of no bars held, like he said exactly what he wanted, and it could be considered offensive to some people. But in doing so, he was trying to point to actual societal flaws and things, and that would be considered a diatribe. The next genre is a parody. You're familiar with a parody, I hope, but a parody is, I guess, a version of a movie story, something that exaggerates, that pokes out the flaws in it, and usually is humorous. So like I said, those Scary Movie franchise, the Vampire Sucks movie, there's song parodies, lots of things like that. The next genre is called a farce, and a farce is a dramatic work that's comedic, and it uses what's called buffoonery and horseplay. So the best way to kind of simplify that is it has some silliness. So it seems kind of silly, but that characterization and that situation that's being created is still pointing to some sort of flaw in society. So I think a good way to think about a farce is there's usually something kind of ridiculous about it. And we'll look at an example with our Saturday Night Live sketches. And the next one is an impression. Now, the most familiar form of impression is probably that you're most familiar with is when a comedic actor will do an impression of a real person. So, for example, Alec Baldwin's impression of Donald Trump. I'm blanking on her name now, but she's hilarious. The girl who does Hillary Clinton in the Saturday Night Live sketches, those are impressions. So what they're doing in an impression is obviously they're dressed to look like the person, but they're usually exaggerating some aspect of their character. I think a lot of times with Donald Trump, they'll mock his voice and his hair and things like that. And that's an example of satire because obviously it's an exaggerated version of that person. So it's not really literally true, but it's created to sometimes insult, other times to mock the person themselves. So when we talk about figurative speech, these are kind of the terms that are used to create satire. So the first one, hyperbole, is to exaggerate. And in parentheses, I have the verb form of these words because when we're writing about them, especially on FRQs and stuff, we don't want to say the author uses hyperbole. We'll say the author hyperbolizes blank. So what are they exaggerating? An understatement is the opposite. So it's kind of like underselling something or minimizing something. And this can be used to create that satirical effect when it's obviously something like world hunger, but if that's being minimized for the sake of humor, that's probably pointing to like an irreverence for the problem. Irony is something that's created. Irony is a situation that the writer creates. And I guess like the dictionary definition just says the difference between expectation and outcome. So when you as a reader are expecting one thing but another happens, irony itself is really kind of hard to describe, but it's essentially me as a reader or watcher expecting something but getting a different response. And that's the best way I can describe it as a definition. Like I said, the best way is to see the situation. So for example, there was a Saturday Night Live sketch in which it was a lot of the actors, including Justin Timberlake, who was hosting, acting as immigrants coming to America. And Justin Timberlake's character is talking about how one day he will have a great-great-great-great-grandson who will bring sexy back. And that's funny because it's ironic. It's ironic that he would mention that because, as we know, Justin Timberlake is well known for that song. So that creates an ironic situation. A caricature is kind of like an impression, really, but it's an exaggerated form of a character, a person. If you think about what a caricature is, it's that drawing. When they create those drawings, they usually choose something to emphasize. So like they'll give you a really big nose or really big ears or really big cheeks when they create that caricature type picture. So anytime they're kind of exaggerating the features of a person or a type of person, that could be called a caricature. So for example, if I wanted to do a caricature of a politician, I might have them describe them as uninterested in the common man, walking around in a black suit, white shirt, red tie, sort of caricature of what I picture as an exaggerated form of the politician. Sarcasm is obviously saying the opposite of what is meant. Sarcasm is something you're all familiar with. I'm sure your parents tell you not to be sarcastic, because I remember my parents telling me all the time. But an example would be like, oh, I just love doing AP multiple choice tests. Nobody loves them. And in fact, you're stating the opposite, which you don't love. And then another piece of figurative language, like we talked about, is the tone. And remember, when we're talking satirical tone, we're talking in terms of the speaker or the writer. Because those are two different people, and I think it's hard to remember that sometimes when we're writing, but the character is speaking. The writer is creating that character. So when we're talking about tone, we're going to focus in on the speaker, not necessarily the writer. All right, let's quickly look at a sample here. This is like a web comic, like we mentioned, and it has a sequence of images, and I want to do a couple things here. What is the targeted issue, or what is the flaw, I'm sorry, and what technique is being used. So first character says, I like squares, and I prefer circles, but we still respect each other. Get that dirty bullshit out of my face. Okay. Obviously, it is targeting the fact that people who are different struggle to be tolerant of one another because the man holding the circle is intolerant of the man holding a square, right? So what we have here in terms of the literary technique is this is a really exaggerated response, right? Someone holding a little circle and someone holding a little square are not going to probably get so defensive and ask you to get it away from them, okay? But by creating this scenario and showing this situation, it's kind of connecting and satirizing the bigger issue, which is that people are being intolerant of one another. So were I to do an analysis of this, I would probably say the writer creates an exaggerated reaction from the man with the circle to show how oftentimes we can be intolerant of one another even over silly things. And that would be my assertion. Then I'd bring in my evidence and then my commentary to fully develop that statement. So that's satire. I just wanted to give you like a rough overview. Frankly, it's something that you just kind of got to see and have experience with to really understand. But we will definitely put in a lot of practice to make sure that we are recognizing it for that question 2 FRQ.